that the main character is a newcomer to the workplace who doesn't know how to say no and is often instructed by his company seniors to do various chores and pick up various deliveries. When Pat first meets Jane by chance, he doesn't realize that in the future, this man will be his leader and falls for his good looks and politeness. Pat has the ability to work, but can't control his emotions very well because of working for the senior Ying's sister. Instead of putting the blame on him, Pat, who is furious, exposes Ying's sister's behavior on the spot. Jane, the supervisor, warned Ying while pointing out that Pat should not be so impulsive and should have regard for the image of the team. His behavior today will affect the company's impression of the entire department. Jane is a person who seems perfect but is a very self-centered person at work. Even after that, he saw Pat's talent and asked him to manage a new brand, but it tormented him. He kept saying that the briefs weren't neat enough and that he had to be told that he hadn't been told ahead of time. When he came up with a new idea for a presentation to a client and was so angry that Pat was impulsively tempted to leave the job. Just as I was writing my exit report, the company's internal review popped up on my computer. So Pat, in a drunken stupor, writes out his displeasure with Jane straight away. After writing them, he sent them directly to Jane, his client, to read. However, instead of getting angry after reading Pat's comments about himself, Jane realizes that her co-workers around her are afraid of him because it puts too much pressure on others at work. In turn, it will make him start to re-examine himself and start to find ways to get closer to his co-workers. He took them along to play badminton and sing. Jane, in order to show the value of her department to the company as soon as possible, insisted on taking the proposal that had not yet been completed, reporting it to the top, and stealing the work of other departments. Pat 1 feels like he hasn't changed at all, and the relationship between these two is starting to go bad again. Pat started thinking about finding his weaknesses as a way to blackmail him and keep him from towing the line. Unfortunately, you can't search for him online, and he doesn't use social media at all to spy on his co-workers. No one knows why he left his job 2 years ago, either. In the restroom, he overhears that he has a date on Sunday and thinks it's his girlfriend, but it turns out to be his niece. Even the nail polish in the couch belongs to his youngest niece. Eventually Pat found him shopping for women's handbags and was going to discuss it with his best friend, but in the heat of the moment, sent the message to his work group. However, Jane appears to be someone who doesn't get angry. After Pat confesses to him why, Jane is still explaining to him that all her previous behavior was because she saw potential in his work. He also admits that he is not a perfect person with this personality of not feeling comfortable leaving his work to others and being so direct in his speech that he is easily annoyed. At the company meeting, although other departments objected to Pat's seniority, Jane fought for the project and made Pat the project leader. The project is handed over to Pat though, and the company unanimously agrees to use his ex-boyfriend as the lead, because the ex turned out to be a bldrama actor with his own CP, and because his colleague shot is sick, Pat can only use one person as two, but luckily the advertising agencies he works with are familiar with him. On Jane's side, that is also pressuring him to get into management and change the company as soon as possible. Jane, however, wants to wait a few more years for his current department to make something of itself. Jane is worried that Pat can do it alone and wants to go over to Pat. It just so happens that the ad agency and the A's are not on the same page about the shooting scenes, and Pat, not wanting to worry Jane, suggests that they meet at a hotel, but because the air conditioning in one of the hotel rooms is broken, Jane offers to let Pat stay with him in the presidential suite. That said, it's a little awkward sleeping in the same bed as your boss. In the morning, the boss prepares breakfast and calls them to eat, and Pat begins to unconsciously groom herself. Party A still decides to use the flagship store for the commercial shoot, and Jane thinks Jan won't agree and will screw things up when the time comes. So Pat suggested a new location, and Jane agreed that it would be easier to convince the A's by letting them see the full picture and having real actors out on the set. Pat can only enlist the help of her ex, and is asked to co-star in a couple shoot with Put. Jane looked at the group photo, guessing she sensed a hint of something wrong, and immediately asked Pat where the next location was, ready to go straight over and wait for him. But he waited for the love interest first and pulled Pat away right in front of him. The video was shot, but A was happy, and everyone was happy, and the happiest of all, of course, is Jane, who sends her love rival Patkin. Even Pat thinks he's a little strange, because he simply never took his eyes off Pat. Even on the phone with his dad, he was keeping an eye on Pat, staring at Pat eating the shrimp cakes he made, seeing him spit out the celery and the shrimp crackers because he didn't like it. Jane blushed and didn't even want to answer the phone. He went home and immediately remade 3 portions out of it, and forced his own brother to try it to see if it masked the celery flavor. 2 good friends started writing overtime for a product promotion. Pat was originally full of joy to go to his senior's appointment, But not only was his appointment broken by his seniors, but he also happened to meet his boss. In order to dine with Pat, Jane pretends that there is a restaurant buy one get one free, and while eating, she says that she can't also find him after work to talk about work, and teases Pat about having a more sensitive sense of taste. At work, Pat is purposely avoiding contact with Put, but Put is always approaching him intentionally or unintentionally, which makes Pat a little unhappy. On the other hand, his seniors in the U.S. asked him to dinner, and it turned out that they wanted to pull Pat into direct sales. Pat runs out just in time to get a call from Put. Pat lies that his boss is looking for him, which gets rid of the seniors. At work, Pat is also increasingly recognized by Jane. Jane even wanted him to come along to look at the furniture, and Pat did not expect the seniors marketed to their own company, which is a bit reluctant, but also does not let go of other colleagues. Fortunately, by shot successfully rescued, the first official date between the two was taken very seriously by both Jane and Pat. While strolling through the mall, Pat even pretends to stir fry, and Jane surprisingly goes along with the reaction. It's childish but inexplicably kind of cute. The two seem to be shopping at a Taiwan, and they get the chair of their choice. When they got home, the two cooked again at Pat's. Pat also teased the owner with a chef's hat. Pat looks like he can only make noodles, but Jane likes it just fine. After all, it's not like a chef has to marry another chef to thank Pat for his help last time. Jane agrees to his invitation. At the dinner table, Pat had been apologizing for his previous behavior, but he also didn't realize that the direct sales exec had approached him as well, and continued in convincing Pat to become his direct sales downline. Scared and angry, Pat follows Jane's advice and rejects him outright. I didn't realize that my predecessor also knew what to do. Put is surprised at how Pat has changed and is afraid that Pat will reject his request to get back together as well. Luckily, Pat didn't turn him down when he asked to get back together. On the other hand, Jane still knows that Pat has a fling from the pictures sent by her brother Judd. Finally, after seeing Put's wallet on the set, he confirms that the fling is Put. It's just a shame that the person in question hasn't realized how genuine they are. During the commercial shoot, Put causes displeasure with his rival's manager, Miss Man. Because of his delay in getting into shape, she began to make condescending accusations that Pat's arrangements were unreasonable. Where has Pat been so angry before? Although everyone was helping to explain, Miss Man was still there, saying that she would not relent. Pat ran to the back of the RV and burst into tears. Luckily, Jane showed up just in time to lend him a shoulder to lean on, but Put looked over and saw the two leaning together, and it was Jane's moment to step in next, and he also lectured Miss Man, telling her not to speak out of turn and accuse others at will. Knowing that Jane is the first son of the group, and hearing that Jep is the second son, Miss Man immediately decides to leave as well. Jane finds Put and is supposed to chat about the morning's work, but ends up getting a straight-up snide comment from Put about the evening's killjoy dinner, which Pat had planned to go to, wanting to stay in her room with her boyfriend. But, just as the two were about to warm up, Pat frowns with a kiss. I guess he sensed a different flavor than before and had trouble continuing, so Pat rushed to find an excuse that he had to go to the killing banquet. At the killing party, two men with happy families were singing. Jane and Pat are chatting. Pat smoothly thanked the owner for his help. Jane complimented him on having good control of his emotions today. A drunken Pat is still giving Jane advice, suggesting that his restaurant should get a karaoke event as well. Jane says that if Pat comes to do his planning, he'll give him a VIP black card to the restaurant for an entire year. Pat is still drinking more and more without listening to advice, so much so that he ends up getting drunk himself and starts talking to the couch. Jane excitedly held up his camera to take a picture of Pat posting a picture for posterity, and wasn't sure if he wanted to keep it for himself or show it to Pat. When he sobers up, Pat finally recognizes his heart and breaks up, even though Put still says he loves him. Over 2 years has caused Pat to lose her feelings for him. Even if he was nice to him now, it wouldn't make up for the hurt he'd done before. Meanwhile, Pat denies liking anyone else. At the company, under questioning from her colleagues, Pat admits that she and Put had a previous relationship but have now broken up. At work, Jane intentionally approaches to ask Pat if he remembers their agreement. Pat said he's been busy lately and there's going to be a delay.
ไม่เป็นไรครับสงสัยพัดจะจำไม่ได้
ไม่กล้าทวงพัดละครับ
On this day, Pat accompanies her best friend to a maternity checkup and talks about her breakup. The best friend thought Pat was hurt and was so angry that she had to call someone to scold her. Luckily, Pat said she initiated the breakup and said she wanted to be alone. For this reason, he even cancelled his invitation with Jane. While his best friend heard something different, Pat was at a loss. Jane, on the other hand, is agonizing over not getting a response from Pat and is pondering whether she wants to continue. Hey, mature men just think too much about love. But the next minute, he's all smiles over Pat's inviting text and refuses to tell his friend who that person is. Luckily, His friend wasn't stupid and guessed his fear that it would be awkward at work if his boss fell in love with his subordinate. Still, his friend encouraged him to follow his heart. The next day was the day to kick off the pair shop hopping tour. This looks like Jane takes this date very seriously. Having just channeled the first store, he went to the store early, had the clerk set it up, and purposely chartered an area of the store for the two of them to be alone. At the same time, he mentally mulled over the fact that this wasn't a date, and that Pat was just here to help him with his work. Jane really is a lovely older man. He nervously finished ordering for both of them, restraining himself the entire time. The latter two are almost spotted by Shot, so the two also run one through the back door and one through the front. But Shot still saw Jane's back. In the second store, Jane had been even more encouraged in her mind to think about making her feelings known to Pat. Pat is feeling a little drunk. The two talked about how Pat thought he got along with Jane when they first met and now thinks Jane is great. Just as Jane is wondering if it's time for a confession, Pat is once again confused. After that, the two started taking pictures of each other and passing them around. Seeing the pictures from work, Pat remembers his ex-boyfriend and instantly starts to feel bad again as he runs to the bathroom. When Pat returns, Jane buys him pro milk tea and has another confession brewing in her head. Unfortunately, he didn't end up doing the talking. Jane could see that Pat was still upset and decided to take him to a secret bar to unwind, accompanying him as he tried every drink. Pat is a little brain dead from drinking and pushed Jane about to go dancing. Jane was reluctant, but was pulled through. Pat hugged Jane, letting out her pain and talking about holding him. Jane is also a talent for starting his own confessions again when people are not sober. Pat can't remember what he has said at all. At the moment, he was just surprised that his boss actually liked men. The next morning, Pat wakes up with a hangover to find his own mother at home making breakfast. Just as he was eating breakfast, his mom was beside herself with excitement that the guy who brought him home last night was, again, handsome and polite and tall. Unbeknownst to him, his son is secretly distressed by his boss's sudden confession. So, that's when he started his escape strategy and just took a day off. And with his birthday coming up, his father came over for a vacation. Pat's involvement in the commercial project was also filmed and the finished film was viewed with colleagues. While watching the movie, Pat and Shot felt a little frowning. Dane, who notices the scene, comes over and hands him his jacket, but he turned his hand and Dave shot his jacket, with the pretense that Shot was colder. Jane doesn't think this is going to work and suggests that the two go out and have a chat. After agonizing over it for a long time, Jane finally said the confession she'd been thinking about for so long in person. Pat, not knowing whether it's Shot or low self-esteem that makes him feel unworthy of his boss, or that the other man is toying with him, surprisingly rejects Jane's confession of love. So the two brothers, who share the same illness, can only hug each other for warmth, and it is only in front of his own brother that Jane shows his vulnerability, despite rejecting his boss's confession. Though, Pat's heart begins to waver again when he learns that Jane is resigning from the department and is looking for a replacement. He was very anxious, but he didn't know what he should do, so he was just so conflicted that he could only hug his parents and cry at his hands and knees. In the end, he lay there in the pile of snacks Jane had given him, wondering if he'd ever be able to figure out what he really wanted. Pat is distraught because Jane is leaving the department. Tut, who looks at Pat who can't even eat because of Jane's absence, knows that the two are torn because of their superior divided by subordinate relationship. Pat even pointed out that Jane's comment about liking herself made him wonder. Shot encourages Pat to trust Jane's feelings. After all, how can he say love so easily when he's so smart? Pat is determined to make things right with Jane and buys a cake and runs to him. And Jane is in the back kitchen of a restaurant at the moment. Pat ran over to him and directly begged him not to leave his job. This period of mental struggle caused Pat to flop onto Jane's shoulder. He doesn't understand why Jane left him if she loves him. Jane explained that she was just changing positions, not leaving. Pat finally says, "I like you," and asks Jane what she thinks. Needless to say, Jane was ecstatic. Of course, from then on, Jane looked at Pat with eyes loaded with fondness. Pat gets compliments from Jane no matter what he does. The two also begin to fall in love under the noses of others, and simply didn't want to delay a moment. Soon, the two's intimate gestures attracted the attention of their assistants. Luckily, Yin had come to cover for them, but it didn't look like she could hold them off for long. The previous advertising campaign for the client was a success, and looking at the internal sales figures, Jane praised them for their performance. Before Pat's dad leaves, he instructs Jane to take good care of her son. The next day, the two attend a good friend's wedding together. Listening to the wedding vows of two friends, Pat suddenly asked Jane if she ever thought about getting married in the future.
สักวันต้องเป็นวันของเรานะครับ
Due to the success of the first campaign, the client wanted to continue working with the company. Jane recommended Pat as a leader for this project, and the client was very happy. Jane is even planning to have Pat replace herself as the new head of the department. Pat was a bit flattered and thankfully Jane said she would spend 3 years training him. However, the relationship between the two of them because of this incident, a lot of gossip in the company, but also some people insinuated that Pat relied on Jane guessing to get a promotion, completely ignoring Pat's ability. It also made him very sad. Jane's uncle, on the other hand, is just going to cut Pat out of the new program. He threatens Jane that it's best for the two of them to keep their distance now that the rumor mill is in full swing. Pat wants to quit her job or the two of them to spend some time apart, but Jam chooses to avoid it for now. But after seeing a video of the two circulating within the company, Pat chose to just resign and leave for the time being. And at the company's shareholders meeting, Jane Rootstyle was challenged by the company's shareholders. Even though Jane apologizes and promises to fix it, Uncle isn't going to let him off the hook. However, Jane knew it was his father who really had to be convinced. Eventually my father gave instructions that in order to justify the existence of the digital marketing department, it was required to take the previous program's sales in the first quarter and exceed the sales for the whole of last year. In the evening, Jane finds Pat's house and wants to talk to him, but Pat said that she couldn't open the door for him, and Jane didn't mind. Patty is troubled by the company rumors and doesn't know what to do about them, but Jane feels that the two should face their problems together, not Pat alone, and wants Pat to promise that he will never leave her.
จริงๆอย่าทำแบบนี้สิครับ
พัดล่ะอย่าทำแบบนี้สิครับทำไมมีอะไรไม่พูดกับผมตรงๆ
The next day at a departmental meeting, Pat shows up and instead of Jane being alone, the whole team gives it their all. People are still surprised to hear that the existence of the department depends on online sales for the quarter. Even they need to leave their jobs if the results don't look good. In order to prove the department's capabilities, they needed to develop a new digital marketing program to boost sales. At this moment, the only thing we can do is to unite and fight for the last chance. At the moment, however, someone online has sent out intimate photos of Put and Pat from before. The company also took the opportunity to cut the department's marketing budget. Under double pressure, Pat suggested that he could only plan a webcam event that didn't cost anything, and, in the quickest time possible, he wrote out the program highlights, and everyone agreed so much that they decided to work together to make it happen. However, Assistant Lone confessed to Pat that he was the eyes and ears arranged by Jane's uncle, and the video was sent out after he stole it. After Lone apologizes, he wants to leave his job voluntarily, but Jane doesn't agree, because he knew that behind his uncle was his father. Pat learns from Jane that Jane's father has never actually accepted that his son likes men, but it's also because of Pat that Jane's life is so free, so he's grateful for Pat's presence. Pat says Jane is a man who likes to make plans, which can be uncomfortable at first, but now he's slowly changing. Jane outright says he's a control freak, and others have said the same thing about themselves at one time or another. Pat said that person must know you very well. Between glances, Jane seemed to find motivation as well, grabbing her bag and running straight to Jane's old house. On the way, Jane called Pat to complain that she couldn't find any peach-flavored candy in the supermarket, which was Jane's favorite flavor, but it was too late to go back and get it. Pat was inspired by this and said he could post one on the internet, asking Jane for forgiveness. Use the power of online media to help Jane find peach-flavored candy that will lead to product promotion. First, they needed to find a writer to write an engaging story, and that's when Sister Ying volunteered to take on the task. Secondly, they need to find a celebrity with a huge following to help share it. In desperation, Pat can only turn to Put for help. With everyone's joint efforts, this planning got the attention of the general public and also reached the first place on the search list, and Pat's strength is recognized by all. Unfortunately, Jane's side gets the news that Jen has gone abroad to Japan to study for 2 years. 3 months later, the sale was successfully completed. Just as everyone was excitedly celebrating, Pat was called into the president's office. The president began by recognizing Pat's ability to do his job, acknowledging that he dominated everything. But at the same time, he told Pat that the success of the program wasn't just because of his good planning, but also Jane's financial commitment. Jane knew that her father would tell Pat the truth and rushed to the office as well. Sure enough, he was still a step too late. To ensure the success of the program, Jane simply made the safest choice, but Pat thinks he doesn't trust him and feels like she's just his marionette. Jane couldn't understand why Pat thought that. Instead, Pat just insists on leaving the company and leaving him. 2 years later, Pat's life is on a new track. They left the group and started an advertising agency called Broccoli House with a friend. That day, Shot pulls him in and says it's urgent. Turns out it's about Fjord having a new program about electric cars. The previous ads for this company were done by Pat when he was in the group with Jane, just as he was wondering if Fjord would continue to advertise with the group. A good friend came running over and said he had received an invitation to bid on Fjord's electric vehicle charging station advertising program. Everyone was happy and excited. But Pat had a twinge of doubt. On the day of the meeting with the client, he did run into Jane, but at this point, we are all in competition and have to sit and listen to what the client wants from the ad. After the meeting, the two still met in the restroom. Jane was momentarily at a loss for words, and by the time he was ready to speak, Pat was being pulled away by Shot. He had just returned to the office when he saw Jane's restaurant partner come to the office again to talk about something. He came to the company to get them to advertise and promote karaoke night. Pat feels that it's all too coincidental and that Jane must be behind it, and again has the feeling that she's being manipulated by him. Pat, over here, has been preparing his ideas all night and still insists on doing the presentation himself. The accumulation of the years has also made him more confident, and their creativity has been recognized by clients. After the bidding was over, Jane waited to have a chat with Pat, but Pat says it hasn't changed. He still wants to be in control. Although Jane said that he didn't know about the restaurant ad, Pat's expression clearly read disbelief. The two also parted on bad terms. Back home, Pat was in agony. On the one hand, he feels unrecognized for his efforts around Jane and is afraid that he will always have to follow the path he sets. But on the other hand, one still has feelings for him even now. Good thing also, he had his father around to comfort him. In the end, Pat's company won the bid and Pat decided to take over the restaurant's advertising case. Their advertising ideas, too, have been recognized by their clients. At this point, Pat also realized that it was because he had originally come up with the idea for karaoke that the other party approached his company, not because Jane had asked for it. Pat runs to apologize to Jane and tries to clear up the misunderstanding, but Jane is urging for help in the back kitchen, so Pat can only leave reluctantly. Back home, Pat also found Jane's contact information, but the two hesitated, and neither one sent the message first. The next day, Pat goes to a restaurant with a coworker to show an advertisement to a client. The client was also very happy and kept them for dinner at the restaurant. Looking at the last of the shrimp chunks on the plate, Pat remembered Jane's promise earlier that she would do it again for him. Friends asked how things were going for the two of them so far. Pat just said he was scared. A friend reassured him that maybe Jane didn't have the courage to send him a message either. When he was alone and quiet, Pat came back and surprisingly walked right over, picked up the microphone, and started singing so loud that he could be heard in the kitchen. However, when Jane heard the song and walked in, she just looked at him deeply, said nothing, and went back to the kitchen. Pat could only drop the mic and chase after him. At Pat's call, Jane eventually stops and asks Pat, in a shaky voice, if he still likes himself. At this moment, Pat could no longer hide more than his longing, and he cried and fell into Jane's arms. The two hugged each other tightly. For the sake of pride, the two have held off for 2 years, and it is at this point that they are finally able to look themselves in the eye and take the final, courageous step. Well, that's it for today's video. Thank you for your support and watching, and we'll see you in the next installment.